Whether it was, if I look back to where my heart was lying 30 years ago, with the idea of introducing something which we call tissue engineering, which means in the first world, if we have to rely on synthetic prosthetic implants, these prosthetic implants are never the same as our own organs. So my idea was to culture the patient's own cells on the surface of those implants and trick the body. It took me 20 years to convince everyone that this is actually a good idea. So our story, of course, deals with heart surgery. Heart surgery is the new kid on the block. If you consider that Galen was performing general surgery 2,000 years ago, in the 50s, heart surgery was not performed yet. Neurosurgery was performed. Heart surgery wasn't. So this development of heart surgery is in itself a very, very interesting story, because it shows you everything happens in the end at the time when it needs to happen. And there were a couple of prerequisites. The problem with heart surgery is you cannot stop the pump which pushes the blood to the brain for longer than 3 minutes without being brain dead. So how can you operate on the heart? Well, you need to arrest the heart if you have only 3 minutes. So the heart-lung machine was one of the prerequisites to get heart surgery going, because it allowed for the first time to bypass the heart, to bypass the lung, stop the heart, stop the lung, and operate. But there was another prerequisite, and that was for diseased valves, you needed to replace them with something. And that brings me briefly to the fact that heart valves needed to be replaced. If you go back to the 50s, there were a lot of dramatic developments in medicine. Antibiotics had just been discovered 15 years earlier. So the scourge of the last few hundred years, tuberculosis, regardless of the fact that it is coming back now, tuberculosis was gone, venereal diseases were gone. The entire epidemic of atherosclerotic disease didn't exist yet. Smoking just really started to become a mass phenomenon. The post-war era only started picking up, and this is not picking up with food after they had starved until 45. So the real disease burden of those years in the first world was rheumatic heart disease. So if we talk today about rheumatic heart disease for the billions in this world, rheumatic heart disease was the driving force for the development of heart valve surgery in the first world. So 3 developments made it possible. One, the heart-lung machine. I mentioned it already. The second one was to have prosthetic implants where you cut out the diseased valve. And this in itself is a topic, because the very, very first valves which were tried out, successfully tried out, were cadaver valves. And as soon as the cadaver valves were getting short, and we have that problem today with kids, there are simply not enough today for different reasons, but the next step was to use animal tissue valves. Well, animal tissue is so different immunologically that you have to do something to suppress the immunological side. So animal tissue was tanned. very crudely tanned with formaldehyde. And then engineering allowed to build mechanical heart valves. And the very first one was a very simple construct of a cage and a ball. And it makes a lot of sense. If you have blood flowing out, the cage, the ball is being pushed into the cage, and if the blood flows back, the cage is being pushed into the orifice and the blood can't flow back. It was a genius idea, but all these mechanical valves needed blood thinning. And here comes the third invention which happened in those days, the glorious invention of rat poison. And rat poison works by making blood non-coagulable. This rat poison is still the backbone of our treatment with regards to these mechanical valves. By the end of the 60s, this was relatively well established, and as you know, as South Africans, Chris Barnard brought it back from his time in Minnesota in the 60s. As you know, 67 was the first transplant. And a couple of other centers worldwide started cardiac surgery not long after the centers in the First World War. So between the mid-60s and the mid-70s, rheumatic heart disease as good as disappeared in the First World. We still have it here, and we still have it in most parts of the world, practically unchanged. The incidence is still 30 per 1,000. Even if only 1/3 to 1/4 of them needs eventually heart valve replacement, the number is staggering. So if you extrapolate the African numbers to say for 1 billion people, this would result in 30 million Africans only suffering from rheumatic heart disease. And if you extrapolate it to the annual need for heart valve replacements, it's about 200,000 heart valve operations, which a continent like Africa, but India, Brazil, large parts of China would still need. So this is the burden of disease development which rapidly went apart between the First World and the developing world. Something else happened, and that was the realization that everything in life and in medicine which happens in young people happens so much faster. A young person getting cancer dies so much faster than a 90-year-old one. So now we had a situation where all the heart valves came from the First World, and at the same time, all our patients, when I say ours, here in South Africa, in Brazil, in India, were young patients, and in those patients, the valves made out of animal tissue, which was the main thrust of these prostheses, degenerated within 3 or 4 years. So it was relatively early clear that if one doesn't do something locally, you will never get anywhere because nobody else would do it. And the Indians were not bad in this field. They at least produced a plastic valve for surgical implants. And I must say, my first appointment here in South Africa in '87 was based on the fact that the immediate success of Chris Barnard asked me to come here for exactly that purpose, because we had experience with making implants more palatable for the recipient body by culturing cells of the patient on surfaces and so on. This went a little bit further. When I came back in '92, I had a very good collaboration on the same field of tissue engineering with the biggest American device company. And when I got the offer to come here, they were immediately in agreement that I take that contract with me, and it made a lot of a difference for us here. the infrastructure, for instance, which they built, was by far better than the one I had in Zurich. So we really ended up with a fantastic infrastructure here. But the frustrating part, of course, came when my team, and Professor Besadenheit here is one of my co-fighters of the last 20 years, realized that we had, in the end, 21 US patents with them as UCT, not as persons, as UCT, which could dramatically extend the longevity of a heart valve. And if I say factor 15, it is a very modest guess. But here comes another development in America, and that is, if one goes back to the 60s and Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society had very, very many very good sides to it. One development of those times was probably a little bit overdoing it and is to the detriment of America today, and that was consumer protection in medicine by setting up the FDA. And nobody agrees more than the FDA is a part of any civilized society, but what it led to was that America by now has really fallen back behind the rest of the first world because it has obstacles and obstacles. So we had, for instance, 20 years of very close collaboration with the biggest American device company. They were all excited, not only financed it, we had 21 UCT patents, but in the end, the costs and the hassle, which is associated with changing anything on an existing valve, is so tremendous that they said, look, it's great from the humanitarian standpoint that we do something also for all these young patients in Africa, but it doesn't pay for all the costs and hassles we have, so they all ended up in a drawer. The third development was that although cardiac surgeries, which are the prerequisite for being able to change a heart valve, grew worldwide a little bit in the developing world, dramatically in the first world, the distribution is still a disaster. So we have today a situation where the country which drove cardiac surgery on the basis of having young rheumatic patients, namely the US, has no rheumatic patients anymore, has a relatively small market size, or whatever you call it, of 400,000 valves a year, and is the only area, and of course Western Europe and Japan, which has access to cardiac surgery. And then you have 6 billion people with an estimated 70 to 75 million rheumatic patients. And I just want to give you another number as a comparison. There are about 33 million HIV patients worldwide. So a big chunk of the 70 million will die, but they don't have a lobby in the first world. The HIV patients have a lobby. So you didn't know about the 70 million, and nobody knows about it. And there is a study, so we know that about 24% of them will need valve surgery. And of those, there is an Ethiopian study saying that 70% of them are dead by the age of 27 if they haven't received a heart valve. So this is the background, and I think this is extremely important because this is the chunk of our story. We have a situation, and we had a situation, which affects the majority of the world, and nobody does anything. So one of the first steps was that we tried to analyze where are the gelling points for us to come on board and do something ourselves. We had 20 years of experience with a big American valve company. We knew that we won't get anywhere there. At the same time, we had own treatments which were far superior and allowed us to extend the longevity of a valve by a factor 20, and something else was in place. For our tissue engineering efforts, we had to set up something which you would probably be surprised to see in a cardiac surgery department, and that is a polymer science group, translated into everyday's language, a group of chemists run by Professor Besadenheit for the last 20 years, who work on plastic materials to use them as backbones for very interesting things in medicine, amongst them for the building of scaffolds, to allow cells to grow in and replace something which slowly turns into a real organ. So that was the sort of background. And then for us as SAT, which you will also see is a UCT startup company, the jelly moment came when we realized that 40, 50 years earlier, there were approaches practiced in the developing world which did not need open heart surgery and treated heart valves. This was called closed mitral valvotomy, and used the tip of the heart to enter with a device, with a simple device, to crack open a narrowed valve. It was cheap, it saved millions of lives, and it could have been practiced by a general surgeon. You didn't need to be a cardiac surgeon, you didn't need to have heart-lung machines, you didn't need all that. This slowly disappeared because it was pushed out by a sophisticated first world approach of using balloons and angiography equipment for millions and millions of rand, and echo and all that. So the expertise also got lost. But in the end, what this method demonstrated was that you can actually, in the third world, go right through the tip of your heart and you can treat heart valves. Now what happened in the first world was that for those lousy 400,000 patients, and I immediately retract my remark, and you will too if I give you numbers which go with those 400,000 patients. So these 400,000 patients have a minimum turnover of $1.2 billion every year, and acquisitions go as high as $1 billion, again just for one other valve. So this very pushed up, small, limited market had gone one step further and said, okay, with those profit margins, we can actually take up all the other surgeons in the world who had for the last 15 years, 20 years already, pushed surgery into minimal invasive approaches. And those minimal invasive approaches were initially just small incisions and video assisted help, but with heart valves it went that one step further and used catheter-based technology. So if one looks today at Central European centers, more than 50% of heart valve replacements are already performed on the basis of a catheter and not on splitting the chest. If you go into one of those operating theaters, you will be deeply intimidated. There are expensive angiography equipments, echo, cardiac surgeons and cardiologists together, heart-lung machinists. So this is the ultimate of sophisticated approaches to medicine, and expensive one. But because of us remembering, and I think Susanne Fossler and I are probably the last ones for a long time who have still performed these closed mitral valvotomies with the so-called TAPS dilators, where you just stuck the thing in and cracked the valve and it worked. So it was extremely encouraging to see, on the one hand, this is an option. On the other hand, you had all the frowning faces of the first world guys who said, I mean, just please look at our so-called hybrid theaters, and you really think this is the solution for the third world. And I think we did the right thing to steer the course? And we said, yes, it is. We just need to simplify the procedures to a degree where everyone can do it again. So that was one aspect of our goals. The other one was to say, well, the American company may sit on 21 patents, but we have published a lot in between, and we still have enough access to treatments which we could finally implement. Valves which we implant would last 10, 20 times longer. And thirdly, the fact that we had a polymer lab with a team of chemists who are experts in the field of plastic science encouraged us to go one step further and say, okay, we need something simple, we need something which defies everyone by not needing heart-lung machine and open heart surgery, but we want to achieve a third point. Today's so-called transcatheter valves are being sutured by, funnily enough, worldwide by Koreans. And it takes one person 24 hours to suture such a valve. The costs of such a valve are 30,000 euros. So you can imagine that wouldn't really support our concept. So we said, why not use all the expertise we have in-house on working in cardiovascular prosthesis with plastic and make plastic valves. So that was the starting point. Be simple, be cheap, and use an access which would open up cardiac interventions like valve therapy to about 200,000 in Africa alone. So where are we today? We had extremely exciting 3 years now, where we could demonstrate that the principle of delivering heart valves, which are long-lasting, cheap, in a simple way to the many in need, was very often demonstrated in our animal experiments so far. And we are at a stage where we have much more IP than we had ever dreamed of, because if you get these excited, enthusiastic young people on board, you get double rewards. For me, I'm always saying, for me, the reward of an aging guy is to be surrounded by youth. It's wonderful, the whole enthusiasm which comes there. But of course they have better ideas. We are running in our old well-established tracks. And if one looks now at what we can do is, and you may see in the background just little devices running there, they cover the whole spectrum, from replacing aortic valves, repairing mitral valves, being able, and that is the most, I think, our most important aspect of what we do. If you deliver a catheter-based valve, which means you don't crack your sternum, you just go through the groin or the apex. A commercial product, they have a balloon which blows up and puts that valve in the right spot. But now consider, I'm always using the buccal muscle for biting. This buccal muscle is a very tiny thing, but it deploys 60 to 80 kilopond of force. Imagine a hard muscle, 3 centimeters thick and big. If you occlude that with a balloon, it will be shot out like a cannonball, and it goes all the way up in your brain. So what one needs to do is one needs to interrupt again the heart from ejecting. They pace it very fast, the heart does nothing, and it's really not something which I would recommend to a general surgeon who has never seen a heart. So one of the backbones of our approach is that we have hollow delivering devices. We have hollow balloons, we have expanders which keep the blood flowing while we deploy the valve, and they are self-homing, that anyone in Uganda sees it once and can put it in. So I really think we have to thank many things in life a lot for these 3 years. We are grateful to be embedded at UCT. That was one of the best things. If you see all the bad news for the wrong reasons in the last 2-3 weeks, this is a fantastic university. I'm proud to be embedded with it. And it gives us fantastic opportunities. And the most vindicating part of it is not only that we saw that the principles are correct, that we need to tweak here or there a little bit, but we are as good as there. We had in the last 3 months delegations from China and from Russia, which we didn't invite. They came and they said, we want that. And one tiny little extra aspect I need to mention when it comes to luck. It's very important that we appear on the radar screen of the community, of the cardiac surgery community early. In my youth, the BTA principle, being to America, was a prerequisite for any career. I think, as much as I admire LBJ, I think that part of the Great Society of 65 was backfiring. America has lost the edge. And it's all happening now in Central Europe. So the very big centers for transcatheter treatments are all in Germany, Switzerland and Austria. And here I had the advantage of having been trained there. So it was a little bit of a kickstart for contacts, but I must say every single one of them not only came out once, they are so full-heartedly on board and supporting it, and that has nothing got to do with my initial advantage, that has got to do with the concept. So, closing it, again, these exciting 3 years were a new path in a 35-year-old career and brought a lot of joy into my life, and I can only wish all those people who are close to my heart to just experience the same and be aware of the opportunities relatively early and don't shy back of initial obstacles. Thank you for your attention.